In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte was not just a general, he was a force of nature. He had redrawn the map of Europe with the tip of his sword, leading a Grande Armée of over 600,000 men, the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. To the rest of Europe, his victory in Russia was a mathematical certainty. Yet, less than 6 months later, that same army had been reduced to a frozen, starving ghost of its former self. Napoleon didn't lose his empire to a superior tactical genius. He lost it to a strategic blunder of monumental proportions. He was a master of the battlefield who became a slave to his own ego, believing that geography and weather would bow to his will. This is the anatomy of a decisive defeat, where the enemy wasn't just the Russian army, but the very earth beneath their feet. Today, we look past the legend to understand the human failure that turned a conqueror into a fugitive. Napoleon's plan relied on speed. He expected a quick, decisive battle near the border, followed by a surrender in weeks. But the Russians understood something Napoleon refused to acknowledge. Space is a weapon. As the French advanced, the Russians retreated, burning their own crops and villages. This scorched earth policy transformed the Russian landscape into a void. Napoleon's first blunder was logistical arrogance. He assumed he could feed 600,000 men off the land, but he was marching into a desert of ash. His supply lines stretched until they snapped. By the time he reached a burning Moscow, he wasn't a victor entering a capital. He was a prisoner of his own ambition, waiting for a peace treaty that would never come. For 5 weeks, Napoleon sat in Moscow, paralyzed by indecision. He expected Tsar Alexander I to beg for terms, but the Tsar remained silent. This was the turning point of the strategic blunder. Napoleon stayed too long, blinded by the victory disease that had served him for a decade. He ignored the dropping mercury and the advice of his marshals. He believed that even the Russian winter would respect the emperor of the French. When he finally ordered the retreat, it was already too late. The tactical nightmare was no longer about winning a war, it was about surviving the walk home. Napoleon started with over 500,000 men and returned with barely 20,000. History often blames the cold, but was it the frost, or was it the ego of a man who refused to turn back when he still had a chance? The retreat was not a march, it was a slow-motion execution. The formation, once a proud, solid block of blue, shattered into a line of desperate individuals. The General Winter arrived with a fury Napoleon had dismissed. Temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius, turning sweat into ice and muskets into frozen metal that tore the skin off soldiers' hands. The French were forced to retreat along the same path they had invaded, a path they had already stripped of food and shelter. The geography now acted as a vice. Every river crossing became a bottleneck of death. The climax of this decisive defeat occurred at the Berezina River. Trapped between a freezing river and the Russian pincer movement, the remnants of the army faced total annihilation. Engineers worked in chest-deep ice water to build bridges, knowing they were building their own graves. Thousands were trampled or drowned as the bridges collapsed under the weight of panic. This wasn't a battle of maneuvers, it was a collapse of the human spirit. Napoleon, seeing his empire dissolve in the snow, eventually abandoned his troops to rush back to Paris, leaving his soldiers to die in the Russian mud and ice. The Russian campaign remains history's most brutal reminder of the human failure aspect of leadership. Napoleon had the best soldiers, the most experience, and the most brilliant mind of his age, but he refused to respect the environment. He treated Russia like a chessboard, forgetting that on a board of ice, the pieces eventually stop moving. The retreat from Moscow didn't just kill an army, it killed the myth of Napoleonic invincibility. It was a strategic blunder that proved that even the greatest genius cannot conquer the laws of nature. A single moment of hesitation in Moscow, a single failure to plan for the cold, and the master of Europe lost everything to the silence of the snow.